So in this lesson, week 4, we're going to start exploring how PTSD leads to the disruption of our feelings, like why we don't want to trust our body and what to do about that. Because it's pretty universal that if we have complex PTSD, childhood PTSD, that we have difficulty trusting our body. So let's get into this. So what happens in normal development when we have a parent who is appropriately caring and attuned to us, paying attention to our feelings, paying attention to who we are as humans, is the parent will reflect our feelings back to us. So if a baby is sad, then the parent goes, "Oh, what's the matter?" Right? So the parent will reflect back emotions and help the child understand what's going on in their own body. If the parent is good enough, this starts when a baby is an infant, and if the parent is good enough, then the baby's feelings of safety are reinforced, and then the baby understands that they're going to be protected, and the baby gets this experience of empathy when they're hurt, so that there develops this internal sense of I'm worthy of being cared for. And all of this helps the child regulate emotions. So I said the baby mirroring actually starts in infancy and continues all the way through young adulthood, adolescence and young adulthood. It does different things at different stages in time for the child, but it's a lifelong thing. If the parents are tuned and caring enough, then that's what the child's experience is like. So the empathetic experience for a teenager, for example, is just like it is for a baby and for a toddler. For example, you think about a toddler who falls down and hurts themselves and then looks directly at the parent to see if they're okay. And if the parent says, "Oh, you're okay," then the child will dust themselves off and go back to playing. But if the child gets a message that something's wrong, then suddenly the child's perception of whether or not they're going to be okay is much more intense, and they're much more likely to believe that they're not okay. So this picture shows a parent who is empathizing with their teenage child, and even at this stage, it develops self-esteem. So self-esteem is the combination of knowing that I'm good, at things, competent, and also that I'm loved. And you can see that being communicated to this child. It normalizes feelings. So while this young woman, this teenage girl, is developing friendships and having experiences at school that aren't positive and finding some bullying, the parent who's good enough and sound in their own self-esteem and their own ability to comfort would be able to help them identify who's safe, who's not safe, what experiences they should set boundaries around, maybe sometimes what they're thinking about and how they could shift what they're thinking so that they could navigate the situation better. But at this stage, just like it's much more elementary for a younger child, the parent really helps the teen to cope by thinking through the situation and identifying, how do I soothe myself through it, and what do I want to think about the world? How am I going to navigate the world? It's very important, this mirroring process. So what happens when the parent does it well is that we get a confident child. We get a child who's able to take healthy risks. For example, a new child showing up at a new school who can then identify potential new friends and walk up to somebody they don't know to say hello. That's a healthy risk, right? They're also able to listen to their body. So one of the things that's normal for us to be able to do if we're healthy and have normal development without trauma is to be able to listen to our body to know if we're safe or not. A child who's been receiving the right kind of mirroring from their parent can do that. They can hear the danger signals in their body and use that to help them navigate situations, to stay away from things that might be harmful, and to help them recognize when they're safe and when a risk is worth taking because it feels a little bit scary, but they can do it. The thing about a child who's been mirrored well is that they've been taking little risks step by step since the time that they were very young. Just think about it. A child who has a parent who's mirroring really well, that is learning how to walk, can fall down while they're learning how to walk. And the parent will go, "Oh, you're okay? Get up and try again." But a parent who doesn't mirror well will either not witness that event or go in and try to help too much, which actually communicates a level of anxiousness to the child and fear of taking risks. So we have to really be aware that the quality and what kind of mirroring our parents gave us has a real big impact on who we are as adults and how we navigate risks and how we deal with things that scare us as adults. So the non-protective or abusive parent does exactly the opposite of the nurturing parent. So in an abusive or non-protective situation, the child's body sends them a message that something is not okay. But the messages that they're getting from the powerful adult is different than what the child's body is telling them. In the correctly mirrored situation, the messages and the body, the messages outside of them and the message coming from the body, they match, so the child learns to trust. In a non-protective or an abusive situation, the messages are different, and because the child doesn't have any choice but to default to the powerful adult or aggressive stranger or aggressive caregiver, the child has to choose to trust and rely more on the external cues than trusting what's going on in their body. This is especially true if, while the child is being hurt, the child is being given messages that they are not okay, or that what's happening to them is fine, and what's happening to them is somehow their fault. So in this situation, the child has two choices. They can recognize and acknowledge that they are in real danger. See, when a person is tiny and completely dependent on a caregiver, that tiny human has a very clear awareness that their very survival depends on this other human who's too powerful and who may or may not have the child's best interest in mind. So that child can live in terror with like a very clear awareness of what's going on and constantly being afraid. Or the child, and this is what most people do in childhood, they control their fear by trying to choose to please the threatening adult, by outsmarting them, by being funny enough, by pleasing them so that they're never unhappy with them. Because that feels more like a good gamble to a little tiny person than living in fear constantly. We just can't handle that constant fear psychologically very well. So we choose to try to control the outsider, the scary adult. So if we think about who we are developmentally, when a toddler starts saying, "It's mine," and "I do it," and "no," and when the child starts to have this struggle with potty training that all moms who've potty trained a kid knows, and is stubborn about it and doesn't want to give in, the reality is that this child is developing a sense of ownership in their own body. And that sense of ownership in their body is also connected with a sense of trust in their own body. Like, this is my body. I get to control it. I'm the one who's in charge of it. And that is a very powerful, strong feeling that leads to a theme the rest of a person's life, that they're in charge, that they can choose to trust themselves, and that they can navigate safely through whatever comes up. Now, when we have forms of abuse, especially sexual abuse, if you think about this child who had control over her body in the last slide, because she was able to say no and I do it, and not had to share everything, but was able to keep favorite toys behind, then the sense of a boundary around who you are as a person and your body gets strengthened. But when things like physical abuse, emotional abuse, and in particular sexual abuse happen, it really does send the message to the child that their body does not belong to them. And if my body doesn't belong to me at that very fundamental level, I don't have control and I'm not in charge, then that means that saying no and setting boundaries not only around my own body, but around the way other people treat me becomes very difficult. Because in childhood, during the abuse, the unspoken message was, you don't have control over your body. You don't get to say what happens to you. That's what makes setting boundaries, especially around different areas of life if we've been sexually abused, is so difficult. So every situation, emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and sexual abuse, they all lead to trouble trusting the body and trouble trusting your feelings, because there was no message telling you that what you were experiencing was okay. In fact, what was happening in your body. Your body was telling you that something was not okay, while externally you were being told that everything is okay or that something's wrong with you. So now it's especially difficult whenever somebody's trying to get you to consider the feelings of other people, or when you're trying to heal, to consider your own feelings, because you've never been given permission to do that. And when you do, the conflict is so difficult, because to survive, you've had to watch outside of yourself so closely to try to keep yourself safe, that now saying, okay, wait, what is it that I need and how do I meet my own needs, feels dangerous. Add to that when we have PTSD or CPTSD, what I've already said is that the environment is different than what our body is telling us. And when our trauma brain starts to get engaged, our trauma brain tells us again, the environment is not safe. You need to do something to keep yourself safe. You need to engage in those behaviors that made you feel safe when you were younger, even though your environment may be very different now. All it takes is one tiny little thing to be similar for the trauma brain to kick in. So now again, there's something in the external environment saying you're not safe. And now your body, recognizing the old situation, will agree with that, and we become confused and afraid and feeling unsafe in our body, even when there's no external danger. So make us believe that we're not safe when we are, or if we're still interacting with people who feel familiar in the same way that we experienced in our abusive background, we could feel safe because it's familiar with someone, or in situations that actually aren't safe to us, because our body recognizes this thing as familiar, and we know how to sort of automatically go into these patterns of survival behaviors that make us feel safe even though we're not. So it is complex, but what do we do about it? That's the question. What do we do about this reality that a safe environment could feel unsafe to us still, or we could be in an unsafe environment and feel safe because we're engaged in our trauma behaviors that kept us safe before, but that aren't really keeping us safe anymore? What we have to do is we have to separate what happened before from what's happening now. And the first place we have to start is with the rules that were set up for us in childhood that kept us from feeling anxious. So if you think about it, in my family where I grew up in, like, nobody's ever allowed to upset mom. but mom's a crazy boundary breaker. So that means that if I want to be happy and safe around my mother, I have to be willing to go back into my self-protective mode of super pleasing. Well, that's not okay. So think about the rules that were set up. They keep you feeling anxious because they don't seem to fit the context. They don't seem to take your needs into consideration first. And then we also have to separate the triggers that were related to the trauma. So if we start looking at the rules, we can say, okay, these are rules that are not okay. These are rules that I don't agree with. They don't fit my value system. And then we can look separately at the triggers. They're often connected, but when you're first doing this beginning exploration, it's easier to find the rules than the triggers. It's easier to identify what makes you uncomfortable than it is to go, okay, what exactly was it about that made me uncomfortable? So you have to start looking at the rules. You have to start looking at the way you behave when you're around people, when you don't feel safe, and think about what do you think that you have to do, even though nobody's telling you you have to do that. You're probably in a triggered state. I want you to also really use the tools that you've already been given. So you already know how to breathe. You already have those two powerful questions. Is it real and is it now? You already have your inherited survival kit. You already have the stress scale and stress reduction activities. So I want you to use all of those tools to help you stay calm in your body while looking at what happens to you when you start to feel triggered. Because all of it has a logic. It all makes sense. I know that when we feel triggered, it feels like it's coming out of the blue and it doesn't make any sense at all. But if you look at it in the context of your life and what has happened already, it makes perfect sense. What we're going to be looking for is how does it make perfect sense so that we can target those triggers in a way that helps your brain to heal. So use the tools that you already have while you're looking at how do I separate the rules from the things that are making me feel triggered. Our next focus this week is to really start to retrain your body and mind so that you can appreciate and trust your feelings as a reliable feedback system. This whole thing, healing your PTSD while following your body, is really about figuring out how things make sense, giving your body history and the context of the things that happened to you in your life so that we can go back and look at them without telling the story and start to really make sense of things and unravel the triggers so we can heal them in present time. So next lesson, since we're talking about feelings, is about the purpose of feelings. So do whatever you need to do, notes that you've needed to take in this session. Start to really think about how your triggers are connected to rules and get ready for our next lesson so we can talk about the purpose of your feelings. See you in the next lesson.